Welcome to the Times of Israel's What Matters Now, a weekly podcast looking into one issue affecting Israel and the Jewish world right now. I'm your host, Amanda Borschel-Dan, here with ambassador, diplomat, author, a person who really needs no introduction, Dennis Ross. Dennis, thank you so much for joining me here in our Jerusalem office.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
It is such a pleasure. And I think I have enough questions to make about 3 episodes. So I'm going to whittle them down. And I'd like to just first begin with your impressions of what is taking place or what just took place in Alaska between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin.
You know, it's really hard to know exactly what took place until we see what comes out of the meetings between President Trump and President Zelensky and a host of European leaders who will be there in the room as well. I can't think of another example where we saw a negotiation that was handled at this level with leaders and with one party to a conflict, meaning Ukraine, coming with what amounts to a number of strong allies to deal with President Trump. The context is a summit that clearly wasn't prepared very much. A summit in which the president went into it saying he was going for a ceasefire, and he came out of it saying the best thing is to go for a deal quickly on everything. What we know is what Putin, in effect, has said, because he, again, used what is his code word, root causes. We have to deal with the root causes. Well, the root causes for him are the security architecture in Europe that has NATO on the front lines of Russia. What we know when he talks about root causes is that Ukraine can't be militarized. What we know when he uses that term is that basically he thinks Ukraine can't be a member of NATO, can't be a member of the EU, effectively is under the sovereignty of Russia as opposed to its having a real independent standing. So if he's still based on that, it doesn't look like he's made many concessions. When we hear terms about territorial swaps, if there were real swaps, we might be talking about something quite significant. Right now, the only thing we know is that Putin is, in a sense, demanding Donbass, which 80% of which Russia forces are in control of, 20% of which they are not. So this would mean he's getting that, and what is he giving in return? Now, to be fair to the administration, they're not really spelling out. We've seen Steve Witkoff say in one interview that there would be security guarantees. Up until now, you've seen Vladimir Putin basically say Ukraine has to be demilitarized or can't have a real standing military. It can't have external forces in it. Security guarantees, if they're words, means nothing. If they're actually quite concrete in terms of other forces being in there, establishing what would be red lines, then maybe there is something that's been achieved. So it's a little bit, it's easy to say nothing was achieved because on the surface, you can understand from a Ukrainian standpoint, it looks like it's all give on their part and they're not getting very much. But if in fact there's something more to this when it comes to security guarantees, and if it isn't just a case of Ukraine is surrendering territory. And by the way, the territory that Putin wants in the Donbass area is not only an area that they don't control now, but it's a defensive line for Ukraine. It's a much more defensive line that is sustainable for them, which they would be giving up. And then again, you say, what are you getting in return? By the way, it's also the area where most of the rare earth minerals are. So there's this U.S.-Ukraine deal, which we're going to be investing in getting a payoff from. But if these are going to be under Russian hands, what are we talking about? So I think there's more questions than answers. I know what I'll be looking for. I'll be looking for what are the signs that Putin is making concessions, that these are not just Ukrainian concessions, and do the concessions that he's prepared to make, are they irreversible? If he's making concessions that basically, look, we're going to be in a better position and maybe we decide to go back to war in 4 or 5 years, that would obviously be something that is driving the major concerns of the Ukrainians. One last point on this. According to the constitution in Ukraine, the president can't make territorial concessions on his own. So he could say, like, I can make a recommendation for this, but he's going to have enough in return from the Russians that is credible enough that any concessions that he might be called on to make, he can rationalize and legitimize and gain support for domestically.
And that would take a referendum, some kind of popular referendum or something through the government.
Presumably it could be the parliament that would ratify it. So I'm not sure it would take a referendum.
Okay. Everything you're talking about is so interesting and, of course, plays into U.S. President Trump as the deal maker. And so you never really know what's part of the deal. Is part of the deal taking the minerals from Russia instead of taking them from Ukraine? We just don't know anything at this point. And it's really fascinating to hear your take, especially since, of course, you were party to negotiations, perhaps not exactly like this, but similar negotiations throughout your career in two administrations, Republican and Democrat, which to me is also extremely rare, especially today in such a polarized world. But back in the day when you were with George W. Bush, the U.S. was in a completely different position in terms of stature.
Yeah.
And let's talk a little bit about the changing shape of the world from a unipolar world to a multipolar world.
Right. So I wrote a book that came out this year called Statecraft 2.0, What America Needs to Lead in a Multipolar World. And I wrote it because the initial book I wrote on statecraft back in 2006 was a world characterized by two things. Number one, it was a unipolar world. There were no American challengers. Literally no American challengers. Russia was weak, and China was basically part of the world structure, rules-based structure we had created. That's on the one hand. On the outside, on the inside, domestically, there was a debate over Iraq, but there wasn't a debate over whether or not the United States should be a leader in the world, should be leading the world. So today, now we have real challengers internationally and regionally in a way we did not have then. And domestically, we don't have a consensus any longer on should America have a leading role in the world. We have people on the left who think we need to withdraw. We have the MAGA world, which thinks we should withdraw. This notion that you have a political spectrum that's a straight line left to right, it's not. The two extremes actually come together. Rand Paul's view of what America's role in the world should be maybe isn't based on values, but he thinks we should withdraw, and he thinks that American bases help to produce conflict. That we're the source of conflict by our presence. The progressive wing of the Democratic Party has a very similar view. Maybe not, they'll define things in humanistic terms, but they also see the U.S. as a hegemon. And that's what produces conflict. Somehow neither one of them attempt to explain, well, how do you explain Russia and Ukraine? This is the U.S. presence is what produced that? No, you have a president in Russia who has an image of what Russia was and then what needs to be again. His foreign minister wears a shirt walking into the summit that is CCCP, which is in Cyrillic, is USSR. So this isn't Russia. This is trying to reestablish what was. So you have a world that is different at a time when we don't have a domestic consensus on what our role in the world should be. We face more challenges on the outside. We have a president who tends to define foreign policy more in terms of commercial deals, and he wants to be seen as a peacemaker, which I think is he genuinely would like to be seen as a peacemaker. Doing deals is pretty much what defines him. The question is, are these deals rooted? Have they been thought through? What helps to ensure that these are going to be enduring? There's all sorts of elements that go into this. You know, President Trump would like to get the Nobel Prize. If he produces peace in this part of the world, I hope he gets it. You know, the aim should be peacemaking. The key is to approach it in a way that gives you the greatest possibility of producing it.
One of the things that I assume somebody like Putin thinks about is, okay, I'll make a deal with this president in, 3 years, he's out of office. Who knows who is the next person in? Maybe I'll make a deal with that person or maybe not. I'm here forever. And so who really cares what the U.S. has to say? But that, of course, plays into your theory that it's a multipolar world right now, that the U.S. has basically lost its standing as the world leader. And we here in the Middle East, we're used to being the playground for every kind of power play that's going on throughout the globe. But it's interesting to me that it's hit Ukraine for so long, and that nobody seems to have a way out of it to resolve this issue, this tug of war that's going on between these multipolar entities that nobody really has the upper hand right now.
But there is an irony. When the U.S. joins with its allies, it's dramatically stronger technologically, economically, resource-wise. So one of the points I was making in the book, okay, we have to carry out our policies so they're more effective. That means you have to use all the tools available to you. Statecraft involves using the diplomatic tools, the economic tools, the intelligence tools, the military tools, the management tools, the informational public framing tools, and having them all work in sync. And we don't have the luxury of not being able to integrate all our tools. By the way, when you're talking about diplomatic tools, it means, okay, use your allies. Your allies are additive. They don't subtract from you, they're additive. So how do you involve them in a way? We're seeing an interesting example of this right now. To have, I think, 5 European leaders coming into a meeting with the president of Ukraine, with the president of the United States, unprecedented. But it's actually an interesting example of how all these tools can be used in a way that produces an outcome. Now, it's not clear that we shaped it this way, but it's evolving that way. And it's a reminder, yes, the U.S. can't simply dictate to the rest of the world. It's not possible. But the U.S. is still a leading actor. And when it mobilizes its allies, it has much greater leverage. Leverage is the key in any negotiation. If you go into a negotiation and you don't have leverage, then you cut the best deal you can. If you have leverage, you're in the position to say, look, this is what I need. And without that, I can't do a deal. So this administration has much more leverage on Putin than I think it's been exhibiting. Putin is trying to create the image, and we're a big power, they're a small power. I can outlast them. Well, he can't outlast them. He lost 20,000 dead last month. They have 1 million casualties. They have a very weak economy right now. Yes, he can outlast Ukraine if Ukraine isn't supported from the outside. If the Ukraine is supported by the U.S. militarily and the Europeans militarily, then the war of attrition begins to work against Putin. If the price raises high enough, then he looks for a way out. Right now, he thinks he has an opening because he thinks that basically the president wants the war to end, and he's offering him an end to the war, but on terms that, unless we see something different, look more like a surrender of Ukraine. Now, if it becomes clear that that's not going to produce the outcome, and if it becomes clear to Putin that the price could go up for him, then he has an interest in looking for a way out. He will want face savers, but that's true in any agreement. I always say, in any agreement, and this is kind of a key to diplomacy, a shorthand to it, what are you doing? You're taking away excuses for why you can't take a step, and you're providing explanations for those who need to be able to explain, this is why we've agreed to this. Everybody needs an explanation. And so in this case, you're looking to bridge a difference that looks pretty difficult to bridge right now between Putin and Zelensky. I'm not sure it's impossible to bridge, and it's even possible that what Trump has set in motion may be different than what we've seen up until now. But if he doesn't also exert leverage on Putin, you'll find that you're not going to get a deal. If the only leverage is going to be applied on Ukraine, this is a country that's not prepared to give up. They've endured quite a bit. So the idea that they will simply give in because they're under pressure misreads who they are.
Everything you're saying resonates so strongly with me, of course, as an Israeli, because of, the war that is ongoing. And I just have to wonder, however, everything you've been taught and do teach about diplomacy is predicated on the fact that there are reasonable actors on both sides. So let's take it to a place where I believe there is not that equal reasonability on both sides. The Israel-Palestinian conflict, of course, you've been, key to trying to bring it to some
Right.
kind of conclusion
Right.
for decades. And nothing I've seen over my decades of life, a bit less than yours, has shown me that there is this reasonable actor on both sides. And it's quite possible, Dennis, that occasionally, at least the Israeli side is the unreasonable actor as well. But let's talk about contemporary issues, and then we'll roll it back to 25 years ago. So right now, do you see that there is a reasonable actor on both sides in terms of winding down the Gaza war?
See, I've always, in negotiations, I've never looked at it through the lens of who's reasonable and who's rational. I look at it through the lens of what motivates each side, what matters to each side. And there's a gap, by the way, between what they want and what they need. The hardest thing in a negotiation or as a mediator is you're trying to get those who want something to realize they're not going to get what they want, but they can get what they need. But they can't get what they need unless they address the needs of what the other side needs. So you're shrinking these aspirations to essentials. So I look at it in each side. Look, right now, Hamas doesn't care one whit about the suffering in Gaza. In fact, it seeks more suffering in Gaza because it thinks that basically it delegitimizes Israel. Hamas has two objectives. One objective is to destroy Israel. The other objective, if it can't destroy Israel, is to make it impossible for others to cooperate with Israel because it so blackens Israel's image. So right now, the only thing that's going to change Hamas is some sense that they have more to lose than to gain by the current path they're on. On the Israeli side, it's when I hear the words total victory, I know that's not an objective, that's a slogan. So if the outcome is Hamas can't be a military threat, Hamas can't be in control of Gaza, and Hamas can't be in a position where it can reconstitute itself and be a threat again. Those are reasonable objectives, meaning those are definable objectives. And the question then becomes, okay, is there a negotiation here? We have mediators, Egypt and Qatar. I've had a question in my mind all along. How much do they mediate? How much do they apply real pressure? I think the Egyptians may actually apply more pressure in some respects than Qatar does. Qatar is clearly a bridge to Hamas. Do they really want an outcome here? Yeah, I think they want an outcome, but the question is, how hard are they pushing for an outcome that would leave Hamas in a position where it can't reconstitute itself, it can't control Gaza? And is the current Israeli position, the threat that it's going to take over Gaza, is that a believable threat to Hamas? And even if it's a believable threat, is it one that necessarily they think works against their interests? They may actually think this serves that interest of this will isolate Israel even more internationally. So I think the challenge here, the key for Israel will be being able to define a credible endpoint. How will you know when you've done enough? That for me, the key is the following, that Israel is in a position to say, we have defeated Hamas militarily, they cannot be a threat, and we're in a position to have an alternative to Hamas. Now here you need the Arabs, and you need the Arabs who at different points have put together plans. The UAE had developed a plan that included stabilization forces that they would contribute to. Egypt has developed a plan that the first part of the plan looked plausible from the standpoint of reconstruction without evacuation, but it didn't have a security dimension. There's clearly been more work done to try to create a security dimension. What I would like to see are discussions between the Israelis and, say, an Arab quint, which is Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates, the Saudis, and Qatar, to focus on, okay, you come in and say, what is it that you're prepared to do on the ground to show that there's an alternative leadership, to cut off smuggling so Hamas can't reconstitute itself, and to ensure there actually is demilitarization, because there will be no reconstruction without demilitarization. When I say the latter, that's not an argument. That's a fact. No one is going to invest in rebuilding Gaza if Hamas is still in a position to threaten and then to rebuild itself, because they know they'll do it all over again. Okay, maybe it'll take a few years, but they'll do it all over again. So no one's going to invest. That's just a fact. So the Arab plan has to embody all that. Israel has to be talking with them, and Israel needs to be in a position where it hears from the Arabs, here's how we need to see this end. You want it to end? You don't want Hamas in control? You don't want Hamas to be able to reconstitute itself? We want the same. Here's what we need from you. And Israel says, okay, here's what we need from you, so that we have a level of confidence. That strikes me as a bridgeable negotiation, but I don't see anybody doing it.
Because essentially it sounds like to me you're cutting Hamas away from the table, meaning you're removing them from having a seat at the table. It's not like the agreement will be with Hamas. Hamas is left out in the cold. The agreement is with this quint of Arab nations, and it's imposed upon Hamas, who basically needs to submit to this willingly or not. And so I guess part of the question is, okay, say Hamas doesn't agree to this. This quint of Arab nations has to, at this point, commit war against Hamas as well?
Well, here's the interesting thing. A lot of international relations comes back to framing of issues. At a minimum, even if sometimes you can't achieve exactly what you want, if you frame the issues in a way where it becomes clear you're not the reason there's no agreement, and the other side is seen as the reason there's no agreement, then that's another way of building pressure. If there's an Arab plan that says, okay, we're ready now, and Israel says, we're prepared to agree to this and end the war, all the pressure then shifts to Hamas. Today, where's the pressure? You and I can say the pressure should be on Hamas. It should be, but it's not. The pressure's on Israel. So if you're in Israel's position and you know what the outcome needs to be, and you know in the end there has to be an alternative to Hamas, and you know you don't want it to be you. When Prime Minister Netanyahu says we're going to take over and then we're going to turn it over to an alternative, well, who are you going to turn it over to? You have to have an agreement with somebody, and that somebody is going to have to be the Arabs. So why isn't that conversation taking place now?
Yeah, I agree with you. And it's always boggled my mind how much power Hamas has at the negotiating table. But of course, we must discuss the hostages. They have our people, and
That's
this
right.
is huge for Israel.
That's right. But they've also been saying all along, end the war, and we release the hostages. So again, if it's a bluff, then call the bluff. Don't always have the onus on you. So, there's a logic of negotiations and mediation, but there's also a logic, again, of how you build leverage on the other side. Right now, it seems that the Prime Minister's approach is we're going to build leverage through the military threat. Okay, that's possible, but we haven't seen a lot of results from it. So there are different ways to test. The problem is there are people, who you have 20 live hostages. We've seen the pictures that are, to say they're emotionally wrenching is like an understatement. It doesn't even come close to capturing what is the reality that they're experiencing and how much longer can they endure it. And nobody has a good answer to that. So that should create a sense of urgency. But if you're going to produce an outcome, you need to be working with those right now who also have an interest. The interesting thing about the Arabs right now, they want this to come to an end. They want it to come to an end because it fuels radicalism. That's what it does. That ends up being a threat to them. It fuels radicalism. It's a paradox that Israel militarily has transformed the balance of power in the region, dramatically weakened Iran and the whole proxy network. But Gaza, as Gaza goes on, it fuels the very radicalism that you've just been defeating militarily. So you need a strategy that basically integrates both. You have partners because the Arabs want this over. And you need to construct an environment where suddenly there's the whole world then focuses on Hamas. It's fine for people here to say, why isn't the world demanding this of Hamas? They're right. They're right. The world should be. But Israel's not positioned right now where it makes that more likely. And what I'm suggesting is there is a way to make it more likely. And in the end, if Hamas still doesn't act, the onus does shift off of Israel in a way that also helps to sustain the policies you want to carry out. You want, if in the end they will simply say no and the Arabs find they'll say no, it creates a greater justification to do more militarily. Problem I have on the military side is, when do you know you've succeeded? Do you have to be able to kill every last Hamas with a gun? If that's the case, you'll be there forever. If the answer, though, for success is, some will say, no one else is going to go in and kill Hamas but us. Okay, that may be true. But even then, you're saying to those Arabs, all right, you tell us how much is enough so that you don't have to. Again, it leads you back to reach some understandings.
So 20 years ago, this month, even this week, Israel staged the pullout from Gaza, the disengagement, which was perhaps the greatest act of public relations that the country has ever done, ever. And it, of course, bit us in the butt, without question. So one could think that with this baggage riding on our prime minister's back, it's quite likely that he would be unwilling or reluctant, at the very least, to commit to this kind of plan with the Quint and have this kind of trust that things will work out without Israel being inside again to monitor everything that's going on. But let's roll the history back even farther.
Well, before we do that, can I just make one point? Then we'll roll it back 25 years. But Israel has the ultimate answer to that, which is there'll be a clear understanding. If Hamas begins to reconstitute, you act. And you'll have collective international legitimacy for doing so. So it's not, you have a hedge. It's not like you're surrendering anything. It's not like you're unilaterally withdrawing. You're not doing that. This only takes place in the context of an agreed plan.
You say that, and then I just can't help but hear former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's, the minute a rocket is fired from Gaza, we will hit back 100 times. And yet, here we are. Even
then, I would have had it coordinated. And I said this to Prime Minister Sharon at the time.
Okay, tell me.
You're doing the equivalent of throwing the keys over the fence and hoping for the best. Why not do this in a way where you will withdraw as you see the PA actually assume responsibilities? And the withdrawal doesn't take place until you've seen that. His answer to me was, I don't want our future to be determined by their irresponsibility. He made the decision it was important for Israel to get out. I understood it. I understood the point he made, but it would have been much preferable to have a withdrawal where it looked like it was the PA responsible for the withdrawal, not Hamas. That had the effect of building Hamas's credibility. Look, we drove them out.
Right. But we're coming off of negotiations that took place, 5 years earlier. And the lack of trust was so evident even then. And it seems to me that Ariel Sharon, he can't answer for himself, right? But It seems to me that he didn't trust either body, and he didn't want either body to have any kind of credit, the PLO or the Hamas.
You're right.
The Palestinian Authority is, of course, a failed state. And the writing was on the wall even back then in 2005 that things were not going well there. And so how could we even have any kind of partner?
Right.
So let's talk about, of course, 25 years ago. Can you set the scene for us?
Yeah, well, look, 25 years ago, the middle of July, we were at Camp David. And the interesting thing about that was I was not at the time, I was not an enthusiast for going at that point, because I said to President Clinton, Yasser Arafat makes decisions 1 minute to midnight, and unfortunately he can't tell time. So it's actually 4 a.m. And I said, he knows you're not leaving until next January, so there's no way he's going to make a decision now. But there was an argument that his chief of staff, John Podesta, and Sandy Berger made, which was that the president didn't want to look like he was intruding in the election campaign to succeed him. So the time to have the summit, which was going to capture all this attention, was before you had the campaign underway. He didn't want to be seen as trying to divert attention away from that. And they said, we won't have a summit at all unless we do it now. So given the choice between having a summit and no summit, I said, okay, let's go for it. Now, in retrospect, I should have known better because I knew President Clinton. And if the time was right later from his standpoint, He would have done it later, but okay, we went when we went. You had an Israeli delegation that had its own debates and splits on the one hand. You had a Palestinian delegation that was at war with itself. Arafat would sit in his cabin and he would dream up all sorts of conspiracies. You had people like Mohammed Dahlan and Mohammed Rashid who were anxious to try to do a deal. You had people like Saab Erekat and Nabil Shaath who were kind of trying for a deal, but they wanted to be sure they weren't running too far ahead of Arafat. And then you had others who were, Abu Allah early was negotiating, I think, as I said to him at the time, look, you think like this is a negotiation, you have all the time in the world, you're forgetting this is a summit. And then Abu Mazen had largely checked out. He was there, but he had largely checked out. Akram Mania would sit in the cabin with Arafat, and they were sort of caught up in their own internal struggles. Over 15 days, the Israeli team moved. It took a while because Barak felt he had his own definition of how to negotiate. It was different than ours. And in the end, though, he moved. We made a bridging proposal, and members of Arafat's team were clearly open to it, but he was not. He said no to everything. At the end of this, after 15 days, you'll recall, there was a lot of drama in those 15 days. I mean, we had so many ups and downs in it. There were times when I was actually hopeful because I could see some coalescence on the Palestinian side about readiness to make serious kinds of concessions, including, though we didn't hear it from Arafat, but we did hear it from members of the delegation, including that all the Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem would be recognized and be accepted as Israel, and then the Arab neighborhoods would make up the Palestinian capital. There was movement from that standpoint, but we didn't hear it from him. We heard it from them. At the end of the 15 days, when I can tell you the last night was kind of unending, where I remember coming up with like 4 or 5 different possible ideas. In the end, Barak wasn't prepared to go along with what we were proposing, but Arafat said no to everything. He spent 15 days, he never said yes. Even my tradition, when I used to say, his answer to me most of the time was lanam, no and yes. No, this was all just la. It was all no. And he said at one point, to Clinton and to me, if I accept this, you'll be walking at my funeral. When he leaves, he goes back to Gaza and he's defiant. I said no to the Americans. I said no to the Israelis. And at the same time, he sends us a letter saying, gee, we achieved more than we ever have. Let's have another summit. I actually said to President Clinton, let's not even respond. This means he's sweating a little. President Clinton said, no, we're going to respond. Go ahead and write it. So, if people go back and take a look at that letter, they'll see, look, we spent 15 days at summit. You said no to everything. Why would we hold another summit? Prove something to us. Prove that you're serious. We see no sign that you're serious. Now, the interesting thing is, at that point, he then authorized what were private meetings between the two sides. They held something like 35 meetings. They were working. Clinton had actually left them with homework. Because on the issue of Jerusalem, he said, look, we know it's a bureaucratic city that has to be administered day to day. We know it's a religious city, but it's also a political city. So why don't you do your homework on how you would deal with administratively security and protect the religious sites? Do all your homework, and then we'll revisit the issue of sovereignty, even though we had made a proposal. And they did. And the same with security. They did. That got us to the point where President sent me again out the end of August, and we had meetings. By the middle of September, I let both sides know I could see a way to bridge the differences. And it was interesting, the nature of the relationship between the two sides. The Palestinians wanted one more round, but they didn't want to ask for it. So they went to their Israeli partners, and they're really people wouldn't believe the way the Israeli and Palestinian negotiators at a personal level got along. Yes, they could yell and scream at each other, but they could also laugh together. And this sense of being in it together was pretty striking, at least at the negotiator level. And I remember the chair calling and saying to me, look, Dennis, do one more round. We're ready to go ahead, but they want one more round. So why don't we do one more round? So we did one more round at the Ritz-Carlton in Pentagon City. And at the end of it, by the way, the last day of that was the day that Sharon went to the Temple Mount. But that was by the time we met at 9 a.m. That was 4 p.m. here. He'd been up and back. It was not part of our discussion. It had been the night before, when the only thing on the Palestinian side they asked for was for him not to go inside the mosque. And so it was over, and I then summarized for the two sides where I thought things were. And I got a call from George Tenet, then the head of CIA, who was very close to the Dahlan and Raju because he worked closely with them on the security issues. And he said, gee, I just saw Mohammed, and he said, there's going to be a deal. And he said, what'd you tell him? I said, look, I outlined what I saw, points of convergence between the two sides on all the core issues. And about an hour after that, I got a call from Danny Yatom, chief of staff to Barak, saying, look, we know what you said, and we're prepared to accept that. Because I told both sides, I'm going to recommend to the president that we make a bridging proposal. Now, just because I recommend it doesn't mean he's going to do it, but I'm going to make that recommendation. So Danny called and said, we understand what you recommend, but we're also seeing right now all sorts of indicators that they're planning violence starting tomorrow. And if that happens, we're not making concessions under violence. You need to go to Arafat. And I decided I didn't want to talk to Arafat directly because I'm the negotiator. So if I'm calling him, it's like, what, we're going to negotiate over this? Oh, so I said, well, I'll arrange a call. But I had Madeleine Albright call and say, you know from your negotiators that there's real progress, and we're even prepared to make a proposal. But we will not make the proposal if there's violence. So you have to control us. And he did nothing. I am convinced that, I should tell you just the backdrop to this, the worst meeting I ever had with Arafat, and I think it's fair to say a lot of our meetings didn't go so easily, but the worst meeting I ever had with him was right after the Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon, so the end of May. He was someone who didn't drink alcohol and he didn't swear, but in this meeting, every other word was a swear word. Because he said, look at the way they're making me look. Hezbollah is putting out that I talk to the Israelis, they throw me crumbs, and they engage in resistance, and look what they get. And I'm convinced he decided, okay, I can operate that way too. I think that's where the second intifada, it came from. Because, he did nothing to prevent this. We made several efforts along the way. I can tell you when things changed. They changed. President, we went to Sharm el-Sheikh. We had a second time we had him. First we were in Paris, then we went to Sharm el-Sheikh. We had agreement. Once again, it wasn't lived up to, but the president agreed to see Arafat and then Barak at the White House after our election. And I suggested in the meeting when Arafat came, I said, look, why don't you have a back channel with Shlomo Ben-Ami and Amnon Shahak? Arafat had and all the Palestinians, by the way, had a special view of Amnon. They collectively saw Amnon as someone who respected them with dignity, but he would say to them, this is what Israel needs. If you can't do it, fine, we'll do it. Arafat once said to me about Amnon, he doesn't exaggerate. And what he meant by that was, if he asks for something for Israeli security, it's because he believes Israel needs it, not because he's trying to take advantage of us. They saw no one else like that, but that's the way they saw Amnon. So I said, and Arafat, like Shlomo, respected him because he saw him as a historian, as someone who understood Arab culture, Muslim culture, And he appreciated that. I would hear him say that to me about Shlomo. So I said, why don't you create a back channel with the two of them? And he agreed to it. Barak came 2 days later, and he agreed to it. And the violent incidents went from 65 a day down to 3 or 4. So it showed the level of control that Arafat had. Now, at that time in the Intifada, there weren't bombings, there were shootings. The bombings came next year during, in 2001 under Bush. So there was clearly a change here. And Arafat asked to see me. And we had, as part of Sharm el-Sheikh, we'd set up a fact-finding commission to look into what had happened with the violence that had erupted. So we agreed to meet in Morocco. I didn't want to be here when it was a Mitchell committee when they were here, because I didn't want to look like I was trying to influence it. So we meet in Morocco, and I sit with him, just the two of us. And I said, there's 5 weeks to go. Clinton's gone in 5 weeks, and I'm gone in 5 weeks. And he says, I know Clinton has to go, but you can't go. I said, no, I'm going. He says, no, you can't go. I said, no, I'm going. When he goes, I go. So I said, I'm not going to fool you. You're not going to fool me. You having these conversations, is there a deal here? He goes, yes. And I said, why? He said, because I'm serious and they're serious. And I said, that tells me nothing. I need to know if you can agree to what they can agree to. So I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll give you my sense of what the Israelis can do on borders, on security, on Jerusalem and refugees. And you tell me if you can accept it. So I outlined, this is what I think they can do. And he says, I can accept it. So the reason we ended up with the Clinton parameters was because I called the president after this meeting, and I described it, and he says to me, even we're in a secure line, it was a very good connection. He says, he knows me pretty well. He says, why aren't you more excited? And I said, because it's easy for him to say yes when it's just the two of us sitting alone. I want to see him say yes when he actually has to defend this. But I agree we should bring both teams to Washington and see if we can hammer it out. So Barak agreed to this. Both teams come. I decided when we were meeting at Bolling Air Force Base, I decided to start this by taking each of the issues and shrinking their differences and say, okay, operate within these principles that I just gave you. They spent the next 3.5 days, and then I think it was Shlomo and Saeb Erekat came to me and said, look, we can't bridge our differences. We need a bridging proposal. That's where the Clinton parameters came from. And they went beyond what was done at Camp David. We gave each side 5 days to respond. We said, if you are trying to redefine the parameters, that means no. You have to accept the parameters. We're leaving a little bit of space to finalize things, but you will do. If you accept the parameters, then we'll bring you together to finalize this. And the truth is, the president was prepared to come out here to do it. So we get an answer after 5 days from the Barak government, and they've said it. They have some reservations, but the reservations are within the parameters, not outside them. We don't get an answer at all from Arafat. He has Abu Allah call me and say he wants to come see you. He wants me to come see you. And I said, look, I always like to see you, but if you're coming to negotiate the parameters, the president said, we're not negotiating the parameters. So if you're coming to negotiate them, we're not going to have a conversation. So he says, well, let me check. And he checks with Arafat, and he says, the chairman still wants me to come. So he comes, he sits down, and of course he tries to negotiate them. And I said, I told you I'm not negotiating them. And then I said something to him. I said, I want you to understand something. When George W. Bush comes in, he's going to walk away from this. He's going to walk away from it because he thinks if you did all this, and especially Clinton, if Clinton did all this and he was immersed in it, no way can I do that. And I'm not going to do it. And I said, so if Arafat thinks he can get a better deal, he's dreaming. I said, he has to come and he has to accept this. And I'll never forget, Abu Allah, in a very forlorn way, says that I'm afraid it's going to be 50 years.
Do you remember the date that this conversation took place?
That was, I think, December 28th. And Arafat came on January 2nd. And we were told by Mubarak and Ben Ali had called President Clinton to say, look, Arafat, because we were putting pressure on them, give him an answer. Because one of the things we did, we knew not to present the parameters to the Israelis and the Palestinians and let the Palestinians then go present them to the Arabs because they would distort them. I knew Arafat would distort them. So even as I was going through, after the president presented them, then I went, sat with both sides, went over word for word. And while I was doing that, President Clinton was calling Mubarak, Abdullah. He was calling all the different Arab leaders and laying out what we had offered. So we wanted them to put pressure on Arafat. They were telling us that he can say, after 5 days when he didn't respond, he said, look, if he comes to Washington, he'll say yes. And he came to Washington and he said no.
That was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
And the estimation was it may be 50 years.
Yeah.
Now, project forward 25 years.
Yeah.
And we're, of course, in a different situation altogether in terms of the world, as we talked about at the beginning of the program. But even as the world is increasingly recognizing a Palestinian state, a Palestine, it seems to me that it couldn't be farther away, just in terms of how Israel perceives it. Do you see any kind of merging of this, these two perceptions?
Right now, no. And there's several things to say about this. One, if you go back to that time, the expectations were very high we were going to succeed. I remember after Camp David having a dinner with a group of Likudniks, and they were despairing because they said there's going to be a deal because the Israeli public wants it and is ready for it. So there was an anticipation. Then you have the beginning of the Second Intifada, and that obviously changes things, but we still had a shot. There still was an expectation this could be done. Now there's just the opposite on both sides. In the case of Israel, October 7th changed the country. October 7th is not just a trauma, it removed the sense of security. It created a sense the Palestinian state is going to be led by Hamas or someone like Hamas. So that's a mortal threat. So that sense of trauma, is pervasive, isn't going to simply go away. But there's trauma on the other side. Palestinians, because of what's happened in Gaza, there's trauma there. And the Arabs are feeling that. So now the gap between the two sides is far greater than it's ever been. From that standpoint, we're in a situation in terms of Israeli-Palestinian coexistence, probably worse than at any point, even during the Second Intifada. So the question is, given that, is there anything that can be done? And the answer is still yes, but we have to be practical about how you approach things. When people say two states, that's a slogan. I said earlier, total victory, that's a slogan. Two states is a slogan. It's not a policy. It's a slogan. If you could press for a Palestinian state today, it would be a failed state. The Middle East doesn't need another failed state. Israelis aren't prepared to contemplate that. But it doesn't mean that there's nothing that can be done. First of all, once you get beyond Gaza, you're going to have a chance to do a couple things. Precisely because Iran and the proxy network has been weakened, this source of threat, coercion, or intimidation against those who make peace has been dramatically weakened. So that improves the environment, number one. Number two, there will come a point. The whole issue of normalization, Saudi normalization with Israel, that wasn't conjured up out of nothing. The Abraham Accords weren't conjured up out of nothing. There were those in the Arab world who increasingly felt the Palestinian issue is a real issue, but there are things that we need. And they learned from what I'll call 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, that you need to provide good governance. And we're not talking democracy, we're talking good governance, non-corruption, delivery of services. That requires real, genuine reform, diversification of economies. You see it in the Gulf states. And they saw in Israel, they initially had a convergence because of security and concerns about this. The same threats were the same threats to each side, whether it was the Muslim Brotherhood or it was the Iranians. But it became something much more than that, because water security because of climate change, food security also related to climate change. Then you have pandemics, so health security, and then cyber, because everything is digitally run now. Now, who's cutting edge in all those areas? Israel. So Israel became seen as a natural partner. So the reality of Gaza right now, it's like you have two different worlds. In Israel, people don't see it because they see the hostages. They're consumed by their own trauma, and they see the hostages, and it wouldn't be natural if they didn't. But in the Arab world, and I'm not talking Al Jazeera, which is an incitement channel, I'm talking the normal media, the normal networks. They showed the pictures out of Gaza, and they're horrendous. And so that sours them in terms of their view towards Israel. But it doesn't change what I was describing, those fundamentals. They still need water security, food security, health security, cyber security. When you get beyond Gaza, it'll take some time, but you'll see that one of the things that was agreed on is this notion of the IMEC, which is India, Middle East, Europe, and building the infrastructure for that, and it runs through Israel. That's in their interest, and they know it's in their interest. So you're going to get back to the point where you will have the potential for Saudi normalization, more expansive, but they'll require something on the Palestinians. Israelis will see there's a lot to be gained, but something has to be done on the Palestinians. But you have to start also from the ground up. You have to reestablish some of the forms of functional cooperation and allow it to be seen. Because the idea of cooperation has been completely discredited. And both sides need to see you can cooperate and you gain from it. That's practical. You have to begin to build from the ground up. And then there have to be requirements on both sides. When I see, let's recognize a Palestinian state. You have when the British, the French, and the Canadians, and then some of the Canadians have some conditions, the British have some conditions. When you talk about Palestinian statehood, you ought to say, okay, what are the attributes of that state? I'm not even talking about borders or capital. I'm talking about, will it have independent militias? Well, it can't if it's going to be a state. Can it be led by Hamas or extremists? No, not going to be a state. Can it align with Iran or extremists? No. Does it acknowledge the historic Jewish connection to the land as a way of accepting the legitimacy of Israel? Yes. You should tick off. These are the conditions. I would love to see a policy on the part of the United States where we say the Palestinians are a people, they have a right to self-determination, but they don't get to act on that until they demonstrate, not just in words, but in deeds, a set of conditions. Now, you can't be asking of the Palestinians, you have to do these things and nothing of Israel. Smotrich talks about de facto sovereignty. He said, we're bearing a Palestinian state. I'm saying, I think today a Palestinian state's a slogan, but that doesn't mean forever it should be impossible, because if you make it forever impossible, then you're saying there's a one-state outcome. There isn't enough focus on what a one-state outcome means. It means a forever conflict. Palestinians are not going to give up their national identity. They're not. Okay, does that mean you can satisfy them with a state at this point? Not unless they also understand they have to demonstrate something over time themselves, in a sense that they have, they're not granted a state. They earn a state. Look at the Zionist movement. They weren't granted a state, they earned a state. And so the point here is there needs to be a mutual set of obligations. If you're asking something of the Palestinians, you don't allow Ben-Gvir and Smotrich to redefine the future and guarantee one state, which means, this kind of, the normalization I was talking about won't take place. It won't. It means you'll have this forever conflict. That's not what you want. I had one of the Palestinian negotiators had dinner with me in Rawabi a couple of years ago. And as we sat down, he said to me, can you imagine where we would be right now had we said yes? And I can imagine it, but we're so far from it right now, we have to go back to basics.
We've spoken way too long, and I imagine you have things to do, but I do have one.
Yeah.
You have one more question worth of time for me? And this is such a naive question, but I can't help but ask it because, a girl can dream, right? So imagine, if you will, Israel turns into semi-Switzerland in terms of a cantonization type government. And Israel absorbs, in a way, the West Bank Palestinians. And they have their own regional government, and they have, they can tap into our infrastructure, they can tap into our medical services, our education, our, trash pickups, things of this nature, like become part of the state and have the services of a citizen. Of course, way back in Israeli history, Arab Israelis were not granted citizenship immediately. It would be the same kind of conditional citizenship. I think Gaza, to me, is a lost cause. It would have to be broken off and become de facto Palestine. This is such a naive dream. And I just wonder, could it even possibly, in that next 25 years, in another 50 years, could this be, it's a one-state solution in a way, but it's a state that acknowledges the Palestinians' right to be here and acknowledges their right to the land as well. Do you ever see that this kind of naive dream could take place here?
I don't know. I mean, look, I live in the world of practicalities. I do think there may be formulas, but I think the formulas may be confederation, federation. In 1972, King Hussein offered what was a federation. We may have to stretch our thinking in terms of what is possible. I think the point is, I don't want to give up on the idea that two states could be a reality at some point. It's just I know we're far from it now. I want to keep the notion that there's still a possibility, because when you keep a sense of possibility, you recreate some hope. We've lost any sense of hope. You can't get anything done when there's a complete hopelessness. So I want to preserve possibilities. I want to build from the ground up. I would like to see, as I said, the formula for Gaza in the end is going to be reconstruction for demilitarization. And you have a transitional administration there. I know the prime minister says, no Hamas, no PA. I think the PA reformed should be a condition, not rhetorically, practically. We saw when Salam Fayyad was there from 2007 to 2013, there was actual real reform. Israel didn't do enough to support it. The U.S. didn't do enough to support it. You need real reformers to show that their way pays off. So that could be a first step in an approach, in a process. It requires something else that I haven't mentioned. This is not going to take place unless the Arabs assume a kind of responsibility that they've never for the Palestinians. They have to assume a level of responsibility. If they do that, Palestinian reform becomes much more possible. You look at what has happened to education in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. They were completely overhauled. Let them also help shape a new educational system as part of the reform process. What I'm suggesting, there are a lot of practical things that can be done. And I want to build on what's practical, because, one thing that Ehud Barak never wanted to do things except in what he called the pressure cooker of our summit. Because he said things that you couldn't imagine will change when you're in that pressure cooker. I want us to create a set of practical developments that begin to change the hope horizon. Because unless you do that, we're stuck. We're just stuck in the mud. And the problem is real people pay the price for that.
Dennis, thank you so much, really, for giving me so much of your time. I truly appreciate it.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to The Times of Israel's What Matters Now. Please check out another installment next week. This episode was produced by The Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until next week, shalom.